Welcome to A Conversation with Jerry Moran. You're joining us on Smoky Hills Public Television, and you're also on KPTS in Wichita and KTWU in Topeka. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chapman Rackaway, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fort Hays State University, and your host for tonight's show. Senator, welcome to the show, or perhaps I should say welcome back to the show, since you've done this by your account about 23 times in various roles. Is that right?
I have been a participant of public television in Kansas for a long time, going back to my days of first running for the state Senate in 1988. And one of our major debates occurred here at Bunker Hill on Smoky Hill Public Television. And then 8 years as a state senator and 14 years as a member of the House of Representatives. It's been at least a show, and usually 2 or 3 every year, and I appreciate the chance to be back now with you and be back with public television viewers tonight to talk about things that are going on in our nation's capital and the future of our country. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have a conversation with you and with our viewers this evening.
Fantastic. Again, thank you very, very much for participating in this. And so let's put first things first. And since you've mentioned your varied career, but you've just made the biggest transition, the biggest step up yet, having spent 14 years in the House of Representatives. You're now the junior senator from Kansas. And so I'd like to start with your transition from the House to the Senate. To the casual observer, might not seem like there's that much difference between a House career and a Senate career, but in fact, there's quite a bit more going on there. So the two chambers have very, very different cultures. So I'd like to start out just by asking you, I know you've only been there for about a month and a half on the Senate side, but since you've taken your oath of office as senator, what's the biggest change you've noticed between your job as a representative and your job as a senator?
Well, Chap, that sounds like the political scientist question.
It's a little geeky inside, I grant you.
That you should be asking, but no, it is, to me, it's interesting, and I think it's useful for Kansans to know. I was sworn into the United States Senate on January the 5th, so it's been about 5 weeks. I love telling Kansans that I have a brand new office in our nation's capital. It's trailer number 4, which is a modular building. At some point in time, we'll get a more standard office in the United States Senate office.
So anyone right now who is jealous of the office of a U.S. Senator needs to be careful about what they're wishing for.
At the moment, we're in transition, and so many things in the Senate are based upon seniority, and you pointed out that I am the junior senator. Senator Roberts now becomes the senior senator from Kansas, and I'm the 90th. My tenure in the House of Representatives counts within my class of new senators toward my seniority, so I'm the 90th out of 100 in seniority, and eventually, as we work our way through office space, we'll have an office. But it is different, and I would say a couple of things. Just structurally, the Constitution of the United States grants the Senate additional authorities, including the approval of treaties, so a much greater focus on foreign affairs and foreign relations than in the House. And confirmations of executive appointments. So cabinet secretaries and many others require a Senate confirmation. One of the good things about that is not only are you involved in determining who is fit to serve in those positions, but it gives you leverage over an administration in order to confirm an individual to an office within an administration. Any senator can put a hold on that confirmation process, which then gives you the opportunity to get the administration talking to you about what is it going to take for you to approve. Sometimes you may have legitimate concerns with that individual and his or her capacity or capabilities. My guess is more often it's we need to talk, Mr. President, or we need to talk, Mr. Secretary, about something that in my case is affecting Kansans, and we need your attention to fix this problem. 1 of 100 is certainly different than 1 of 435. It does mean that there is, in my view, greater camaraderie, a closer relationship between individual members of the Senate, and any senator can stop legislation from happening unless 60 senators, because of the rules of the Senate, 60 senators can override that decision. But it means that every senator realizes they have to figure out how to get along, or what does it take to satisfy an individual. So the Senate is much more individually oriented, and the House, I liken the House of Representatives as the Republican team and the Democrat team, and a lot of the focus is on the political party, following the speaker, if it was Pelosi as a Democrat or now Boehner as a Republican, and so the Republicans follow their leaders, much more so than I think happens in the Senate, where it's much more independent and much more about the individual senator than the party, and that's very appealing to me.
Understandable. It sounds like there's a lot of freedoms there. Any downsides to it that you've seen so far?
Well, clearly Kansas has a lot of commonality, whether you're in Johnson County, Kansas, or Johnson City, Kansas, on the western border. But one of the things about the House is that first congressional district has so many features that are very similar. We are small towns. This adds a new dimension, which I don't see really as a downside, but actually an opportunity for me to better understand people, how they earn a living, the industries, the businesses, the makeup of our state. And so we're out once again. My constituents, as a member of the House of Representatives, would remember that for the time that I was a member of the House of Representatives, a town hall meeting in every county, 69 times a year. There's now 105 counties, and we're out doing something very similar. In fact, I finished this weekend my 31st town hall meeting, now out of 105 instead of out of 69. And so there is a geographic expansion that, it adds a few more miles to the automobile, but in many ways it really does continue the things we focused on. And while the first district has been very much about agriculture and small town hospitals, small businesses, Main Street, the reality is that as a small congressional delegation, only 4 members of the House, I've really worked hard at trying to make certain that I understand, as a House member, Wichita and South Central Kansas and the aviation industry, the service industry and telecommunications in Johnson County. And so it's not new, but it's a greater opportunity, greater responsibility, and it would be very important for me to indicate to the folks listening and viewing tonight that I'm very grateful for the chance that Kansans in the first district gave me for 14 years to serve them in the House of Representatives, and to express my gratitude and appreciation for the opportunity now to represent all Kansans and try to make a difference on their behalf in our nation's capital in what I consider very challenging and serious times.
These are definitely challenging and serious times. Good points. And of course, you won election to the Senate during a significant time. In 2010, a lot of Republicans like yourself won seats in Congress with campaigns focused on what they claimed was out of control government spending. I solicited questions from followers on Facebook and Twitter, and one question about that spending came in. So I'd like to ask it to you, and it came from a man named Will Manley, who tweeted, and I'm going to read this verbatim from him, and then we'll move forward. He said, "Is the new senator willing to attack federal spending like a man? I'm talking hundreds of billions in cuts." Now, that's Will's tweet. Let me put the question a little bit differently, though. How much federal spending do you think needs to be cut, and can that level of cutting be accomplished? A lot of roadblocks to that.
It will be a difficult time cutting spending, and while it's easy in campaigns to talk about the necessity, the difficulty comes when it's time to actually do it, and that time really is past time. If it was easy to cut spending, it had been done previous. But I would tell you that the circumstances our country faces, our economy, are so severe, the problems are so real, that there is no choice. And I've been pleased by my 5 weeks in Washington, D.C., in which I have seen my colleagues in the Senate take very seriously, both Republicans and Democrats, the necessity for reducing spending. And much of the conversation is no longer about slowing the growth of spending. It's no longer about freezing spending. In many ways, the conversation is about cutting spending. Now, while I'm pleased about that, what we're talking about in the Senate and in the House at the moment, in fact, the House has budget numbers out there that were presented last week, a $100 billion reduction in President Obama's request for FY 2011. But what's not being talked about that we cannot escape this discussion is entitlement programs, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, unemployment benefits. It is the bulk of the challenge we face. And so you can talk about this discretionary spending, and we must, but it also means at some point in time soon we're going to have that real discussion about the future of our entitlement program. President Obama is to present his budget this coming week, And I'm very interested to see if he has the willingness to present a program, a policy toward that entitlement spending. And I think it will take both Republicans and Democrats. No political party wants to walk the plank of cutting spending, knowing that the other side, the other political party, is just going to bash you for doing so. And so this has to be something that the two parties come together, and President Obama is the leader. And in fact, would be one of my criticisms of President Obama's State of the Union address when he talked about the Sputnik moment. What I wanted to hear is, okay, here's the sacrifice that we expect to be made in order to meet this challenge. And there was no call for that shared sacrifice. So Will's question, I will certainly indicate that I have the desire and the determination to see that we reduce spending, both discretionary and at the appropriate time willing to work with all parties, Senate, House, Republican, Democrat, the President, the people in the administration, people in Congress, to see that we put this country back on its right path. And the reality is we have no choice. Will can talk about whether it's the manly thing to do, which is a pun for Will, but the reality is if we don't do this, our country is not immune from the things that have happened in Greece, in Portugal, and Ireland. The world markets, the places that we borrow our money, are soon going to determine that the United States is no longer creditworthy, or certainly as creditworthy as they would hope. Interest rates will rise, and this issue of deficit spending and the national debt will be addressed economically with real challenges to our country's future. Now, we've talked about the cutting side of spending, and I'd be happy to discuss numbers if we want to get into really what we face. The truth is that we are spending in entitlement spending, the stuff that Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid,
you're getting to my next question.
equal to the amount of revenue that comes into the United States Treasury. Our taxes just barely cover the mandatory spending before you ever get to the things that we do in the appropriations process every year.
About 1.6, 1.7 trillion,
Correct.
if my numbers are correct? Okay.
Correct. So this is these are challenging numbers.
So
in
everything
fact,
beyond entitlement spending is basically being funded
financed
by debt right now.
The Treasury
It's all
Department
being put on the credit card.
Absolutely.
Okay.
42% of our spending is done by deficit borrowing, by deficit spending and borrowing. And that's not something that can continue. In fact, 90%, our national debt is equal to 90% of the gross domestic product of the United States, which means our entire economy, 90% of it is equal to the amount of debt. Our third largest component of spending in Washington, D.C. is servicing the debt, those interest payments. And interest rates are historically low. I mean, they are very, very low in compared to where they normally would be. As interest rates rise, and I have no doubt but what they will, the interest, the debt service becomes almost unmanageable. Now, I understand that's necessary to talk about cutting spending, and that's a significant necessity. But there's also another component of meeting our country's deficit needs, and it's a bit more positive, and that is we've got to grow the economy. Putting people to work is a great thing for people and their families, but it also is the thing that generates tax receipts, revenues. When people are working, they are paying taxes, sales tax to state and local units of government, property taxes to the state and local units of government, and income taxes to the federal government. And that is the way that it is going to take growth of our economy. And I think that was the message of the 2010 elections. It really was two things. Quit spending so darn much money. Get this deficit under control. That's number one. And number two, it's about jobs. Create jobs. And mostly people who are talking about that are talking about it for their own benefit, for their family's benefit. The desire to work is real. The sense that we have a responsibility to our families to put food on the table is a real thing in America. But the other added benefit of that is it helps us reduce our national debt. And we need to put in place policies that promote growth. A tax code, regulatory environment, the fear of cap and trade needs to disappear. Healthcare so-called reform is, in my view, a component to increasing the uncertainty of being in business and reduces the chances that our economy is going to grow. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office estimated just this week in testimony to the House of Representatives 800,000 less jobs in the United States over the next 10 years as a result of the passage of healthcare reform.
Okay, you have been talking quite a bit about entitlements there, and you're talking about things with very broad constituencies. To go back to entitlements, of course, for a moment, been talking about things with some broad constituencies, and those are unpopular cuts to make. But you would support reduction in entitlement spending then on a pretty significant degree? I
don't think we have any alternative. But again, we need to have the leadership of this country, and again, both political parties. And again, I feel better having spent the last 5 weeks in Washington, D.C., in which people are, members of the Senate are certainly talking about that. There's groups, Republicans and Democrats, who are meeting regularly to talk about how can we come together to address this issue. And I think, particularly a signal to the markets, to those who lend us money, that says that we're going to address the issue of Social Security and Medicare would have a huge consequence to this issue and the rising interest rates. We need to send a clear signal that we get it, that we understand. And you're right, the politics of this stuff is awful. In my 31 town hall meetings, I've asked my constituents to, reward's not a very good word, but you now need to accept the politician who says, no, I'm sorry, we can't afford this, as compared to what has happened historically in this country, in which you applaud the politician who spends the money, presumably on your behalf. And so and I think the American people, Kansans certainly, are ahead of the elected officials in this. They recognize that this can't occur continually. And this isn't a problem that we're going to solve in 1 year. And in fact, when the House adopts its budget of $100 billion in less spending than what the President proposed for 2011, we're again talking about a very small portion. And Republicans in particular want to take defense spending, homeland security off the table. Once you do that, you're talking about trying to cut enough money out of 12 to 15% of the spending is what's left, and you cannot cut that amount of money. And so, certainly in 1 year. And so it's got to be broader. I'm one who believes, I always say that nothing ought to be off the table, although I would say that I have certain things that I think are, quote, off the table when it comes to cutting spending, and that is the money that we spend to protect our servicemen and women who are fighting abroad in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's the commitments we made to military retirees and veterans. Those, to me, are off the table, but I don't take defense spending off the table. There has got to be, I know there is fraud, abuse, overspending within the billions of dollars that are being spent at the Department of Defense. And I certainly have the impression the Department of Homeland Security is one of the least efficient departments, and just throwing money at our national security is not the solution to the tremendous challenges we face. So it's a two-pronged thing. Work on the spending, and then make sure we have policies in place that allow the business person in the pursuit of profits and wealth to put people to work.
Very good. I could monopolize this conversation for our entire hour. However, we do have the opportunity for people to call in with questions for Senator Moran. You can call us here at 800-337-4788 and have your questions answered by Senator Jerry Moran here tonight. We go right to the phones now, where Beth from Halstead is on the line. Beth, thank you for calling in. What's your question for Senator Moran?
Well, the first part of my question he has somewhat covered already, because I wanted to know whether he was willing to cut defense. But along with that, military are already saying they don't want some of the warplanes that we are producing. Would you be willing to listen to the military and say, no, we don't need these planes?
Beth, I think that's a good example. Unfortunately, of what I was saying is there is too much spending in defense, and part of that comes from the political powers of members of Congress who want to make sure that defense spending, the manufacturing of defense equipment, airplanes, etc., are done in their own congressional districts. And so there's developed this kind of relationship between defense contractors and public officials in which they protect their hometown business, and in some instances provide equipment, as you say, that the Department of Defense says they don't want. We've had, there's a dual engine issue out there, and we've had this vote while I was a member of the House of Representatives, and I agreed with the Department of Defense that we would not, I did not vote to fund the equipment, the airplane engine the Department of Defense says is duplicative. And so I've listened to Secretary Gates and voted that way, as you suggest is appropriate.
And there's another angle to this, because you joined with Senator Cantwell of Washington to propose a piece of legislation that would change the way the Department of Defense does their decision-making process on aircraft refueling tankers, right?
This is a huge Kansas issue, and it's about employment in Kansas, which we just talked to with Beth, although here the issue is not forcing the Department of Defense, the Air Force in this case, to accept a piece of equipment they don't want. This is the politics and the process of the bidding has taken years. The Defense Department is anxious for a tanker. Our fleet is aging. It was built during the Eisenhower administration. We desperately need new tankers to refuel in flight. And the question here is the competition between an American company and a company that's headquartered in Europe and subsidized by the Europeans. And so our legislation, Senator Cantwell, a Democrat from Washington State, says the Department of Defense has to take into account those illegal subsidies determined to be illegal by the World Trade Organization in awarding contracts. And whatever illegal subsidies the American company gets needs to be taken into account, level the playing field, and get the taxpayer out of, and particularly the foreign support for a foreign company, out of the process in making a determination who has the least expensive product to sell the Air Force. And of course, this matters in Kansas. It's a huge opportunity for those airplanes to be manufactured in Wichita.
All right. Oh, the phones keep coming in. We have Randy from McPherson on the line. Randy, welcome to a conversation with Jerry Moran. Your question.
Thank you, Senator. It's Randy Watson, Superintendent of Schools in McPherson, and I want to thank you, first of all, for all the great help that you have given on our waiver to the U.S. Department of Education, and hopefully we'll have resolution of that soon. My question is, what do you see this upcoming session for the reauthorization of ESEA, and do you see any progress that will be taking place toward that end?
Randy ought to be commended. He and his Board of Education in McPherson are seizing an opportunity to, in a sense, get their school district out from under the constraints of No Child Left Behind. And they're looking for a waiver from the Department of Education to exceed or excel beyond the requirements of No Child Left Behind. And incidentally, Randy, your process is being watched by many superintendents and education officials in Kansas. I visited the school district, the high school at Clifton Clyde this week on my way home from Washington, D.C., and the superintendent wants to know how you're succeeding because they want to be the next that pursues what you're doing. I should first indicate that I opposed No Child Left Behind when it was in the House of Representatives, a difficult thing to do in the political sense because it suggests that you want to leave children behind. That's not my position. I do have the position that education is so important that mostly we ought to be making these decisions at the state and local level, not waiting for Washington, D.C. to provide a one-size solution fits all to our education or other challenges that we face. It's hard for me to know how the reauthorization process is going to proceed. It's receiving attention, but from my view, we need to do everything we can. In fact, the most common conversation I have with Kansans in town hall meetings now, east to west, is either what are you doing to protect the quality of our education in our school district, or what are you doing to keep the school district doors open, the school building doors open in our town? And my response to that is that most of the funding decisions, as they should be, are going to be made in Kansas. And in fact, I read the other day, and I'm trying to get the validity of these numbers, but my guess is, my understanding is that between 6.5% and 8% of the funding for education in Kansas comes from the federal government. And yet it seems to be the dog that wags the tail in this case, where all our school districts are trying to comply with all these things. And the financial reward for doing so is pretty minimal in the overall scheme of things, although in today's budget, losing 6.5% to 8% would be a major challenge for any school district in Kansas. So our goal is to get the mandates that make no sense, like No Child Left Behind, reduced or eliminated, and to fund the ones that are required, such as IDEA, special education. And I need to follow up with you, Randy, well, I'll ask Brian to do that in our office next week to see what maybe he knows the latest in your efforts to get out from under, to get the waiver and to move your school district forward.
All right. Let's shift then and let's talk about another policy that you've been on the record as being critical of, beyond No Child Left Behind. We commonly call it Obamacare, but let's call it by the technical name, the Affordable Care Act of 2010. It's been a touch point of controversy since it was initially proposed, despite the fact that it's got one of those names that's hard to criticize. Who doesn't want affordable care? Who doesn't want to leave children behind? But we've seen 26 states now join in a suit to prevent its implementation. 2 federal judges have ruled against it. State legislatures, including Kansas, have been pushing opt-out legislation, and there have been federal efforts in both chambers to repeal the law. The House voted to repeal it, but the measure died in the Senate despite your support. What can we expect now? Will there be any other action in the Senate related to this health care law?
There will be, and I think it will relate to the funding, the amount of money appropriated to implement. And again, this will be in the House. My guess is the money will be stricken from the appropriations bill to delay or prevent the implementation of so-called health care reform. In the Senate, it becomes much more problematic. And in fact, the repeal of the health care reform bill failed on strict party line vote in the Senate. I think a sad thing about this, let me finish that thought, which is where this now rests, I think, is with the courts. Ultimately, the United States Supreme Court will make a determination of whether health care reform is constitutional. Senator Roberts and I have introduced legislation in the Senate that tells states that they can opt out of the provisions of the health care reform bill pending determination by the United States Supreme Court as to the constitutionality. We don't want Kansas in particular, but any state to spend significant amounts of money implementing the bill only to discover that the Supreme Court determines that that bill is unconstitutional. So we're trying to be practical. The sad thing about this entire conversation about health care reform, it certainly became political and partisan. What I've said even before President Obama was president, that we ought to be making improvements in our health care delivery system. For most of the time I was a member of the House of Representatives, I chaired or co-chaired the Rural Health Care Coalition, a group of Republican and Democrat members of the House who banded together to try to make certain that health care was delivered in rural America, that we had physicians and other health care providers, our hospital doors remained open. And I view this bill as a real problem in the big picture of the economy, taxes, regulations. But I also believe that in the long run, it's very damaging to our ability to keep hospitals across Kansas, keep physicians in our communities, and I think we're going to have fewer providers. So I think the health care reform bill is a real problem, but we ought to be doing things about defensive medicine and malpractice. We ought to be doing things about medical technology. We ought to make certain that Medicare and Medicaid pay for the services they promise to provide so we don't have an inefficient cost shifting. We need to support community health clinics to keep people out of our emergency rooms. We need to promote, not necessarily a government program, but wellness, fitness, diet, nutrition. We all need to get on the treadmill and better care for ourselves, because in a sense we have a system that people pay for other people's poor decisions in regard to health.
Feeling more guilty about you saying before the broadcast you didn't see me on the treadmill at our mutual gym today, but does take care of my next question. And so let's go back to the phones. We have Errol from Hayes on the line. And before we take Errol's question, remind you once again that you can ask your question to Senator Jerry Moran at 800-337-4788. Errol, good evening. What's your question for Jerry Moran? But it has something to do with air service.
That's correct. Senator, earlier you had mentioned that you're willing to make cuts in the federal budget. Regarding the FAA reauthorization bill, Senator McCain is proposing an amendment to eliminate the funding for essential air service. If it were to pass, that would eliminate air service in Hayes, Dodge City, Garden City, and Liberal. Last year, Hayes had over 9,000 boardings. What's your position on this issue?
I will not be supportive of Senator McCain's amendment, and in part because this essential air service program is so critical to rural America, and it's not just the passengers in and out, but this is our ability to attract business, to bring a business person in, to get physicians to our communities. But this service, essential air service, is funded by a tax on foreign airlines that fly in the United States. And so it has a separate, independent source of revenue. And while I can't imagine that we will grow the Essential Air Service program, I think it would be a mistake to eliminate the Essential Air Service program.
Okay. Let's take a step back for a second. Fiscal responsibility and cutting spending has been one of the themes of our conversation so far this evening. And one of the things that I found very interesting was last December, a report that was issued that I felt had a lot of promise. It was the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. They issued a report, failed to get enough votes to send it as a formal recommendation for implementation to Congress. But they suggested a very aggressive regime of spending cuts that would take nearly $4 trillion out of the national debt by 2021. You'd mentioned President Obama's, it's been leaked, his budget that would, over the course of the next 10 years, take about $1 trillion, so 1/4 of that out of the national debt. $1 trillion in debt reduction was made up 2/3 spending cuts, 1/3 of taxes. We'll get back to taxes in a moment. But my thought is, what's your position on that Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform? Do you think that that was something that Congress should have tried to put into action?
I was impressed that the Senate members of the commission, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, voted in favor. And I've visited with all 4 of those individuals. None of them really liked that report, but believed that the basis for what their proposal was had merit, and it was important for them to put their stamp of approval on it. This is me reading between the lines, to move this process forward in, first of all, signaling to Congress and the American people, this is serious. We have to do things we don't like.
Alan Simpson, who is the chair of the committee, uttered the great soundbite phrase, sober up or sleep on the streets, to try to pitch this thing.
And I hope that it is the basis for our discussions, Republican, Democrat, House, Senate, and administration. It can be the starting point and ought to be used to keep the momentum going toward this goal of deficit reduction.
Okay, let's go to the phones again. Marilyn from Wilson is on the line. Thank you for calling in. What's your question?
I understand that foreign aid makes up 25% of our national budget. How come nobody talks about cutting that? Thank you.
Okay.
I'm reluctant to ever disagree with any constituent, but as I understand the numbers, about 1% of our federal spending is foreign aid. It is often said to me, if we just cut that foreign aid, we could balance the budget. But it is a very small portion of how we spend money, and I'm certainly not opposed for us to reduce even that 1%. I would tell you, however, the bulk of that foreign aid, the vast majority of it, is spent in 2 countries. 2 countries, one that's our ally, Israel, and the second one, which is in the news at the moment, Egypt. And so most of the foreign aid is part of the peace process that was in the negotiations that went on, and ultimately Egypt recognized the existence of the state of Israel, and it has been the United States taxpayer. I'm always reluctant to ever use the word federal tax dollars or federal dollars. They're taxpayer dollars are being spent to protect Israel and to support those areas in the Middle East that are not at war with Israel and are helping in the peace process. None of this, again, on my view, with a few things that I said earlier about off the table, this is one that won't be off the table, and I would expect, and particularly in the House, you will see significant reductions in foreign aid. But it is, and unless Marilyn, unless you know, I'll make certain that I'm right about the percentage, but my understanding is that about 1% of our spending is actually spent abroad.
Along those same lines, you'd mentioned earlier that as a senator now you have a greater role in foreign policy. Your thoughts on the transition in Egypt? It's truly a monumental time.
Absolutely, and it's been historic, interesting, in some ways exciting to watch. And the news today is this kind of movement expands to other countries in the Middle East. It made me think back to revolutionary time in the United States and our effect upon other countries and their desire for democracy. My view is, and I certainly would admit that I'm trying to become more worldly, more understanding of the way that the world operates. It's important for me to do so in my position that I now hold, although following 9/11, I concluded that Moran, this guy from western Kansas, needs to figure out how the world operates and what our role is in it. So I've been working at that. So I would just say that my view of what's transpired and the United States' reaction is that we ought to, in almost every circumstance, be supportive of liberty around the world. We're the beneficiaries of others who supported our efforts at liberty, and we ought to recognize that in every human heart there's a desire for a better way of life and the freedom to make decisions for yourself and your family. And so I want us to be supportive of what's going on in the streets of Egypt. I also recognize that we got to be very cautious and realistic, and to try to nudge. Again, I don't think we have a lot to say or a lot to control about what goes on in Egypt, but we ought to be able to encourage the process in which it is a government that does treat its neighbors in peace, and not at war, particularly with Israel, and not a country that becomes an enemy of the United States. We face many challenges because of terrorism, and we need Egypt to be not only the place that provides liberty for its citizens, but the place that understands it has a role in the world to protect other lives around the world, even those that aren't Muslim.
Okay. Let's return to the phones now. Jack from Dodge City is on the line. Jack, thank you for calling in. What's your question?
Jerry knows I'm a victim of Parkinson's disease, and I've been interested in the progress and research that's been taking place, and know that there are many other people in Kansas that are unfortunate to have the same problem.
It's a terrible disease.
Parkinson's is a terrible disease, and Jack is a great human being, and I regret that he faces the circumstances that he faces. A lot of conversation has occurred in the past about stem cell research and the morality. I think we have a moral obligation to make certain we don't use life, we don't end life to in any way. But there are great opportunities for other stem cell research unrelated to embryonic stem cell research. And here's something else, and I don't want to get in a list of things that when we talk about balancing the budget that we ultimately say, well, we can't cut that. But I think the investment in healthcare, in research to find the cures and the treatments of diseases is a very noble and also a very financially sound investment. When we talk about healthcare costs, when we can find the cure for a disease like Parkinson's, or we can find the treatment that remediates the symptoms, we are doing something great for Americans, for the victims of these diseases, and we're doing something to ultimately reduce the cost of health care to citizens of our country. And so the National Institute for Health and others who provide health research seems to me to be a worthy opportunity for us to invest in the lives of American citizens and to invest in the financial future of our healthcare delivery system.
All right. We still have some calls on the line, so let's go right back to them. Kim from Lecompton is on the line. Thank you for calling in.
Hi, Senator Moran. Thanks so much for being on the show and for taking my question. I guess I was very, very disappointed during your candidacy on your stance about the DREAM Act. That's the Development Relief Education for Alien Minors, and it provides permanent residency for kids who graduate from U.S. high schools with really good moral character. They had to have arrived in the U.S. as minors and have been here for 5 years. And it provides permanent residency only if they complete 2 years in the military or they complete a 4-year university, and they are not permitted to receive any, or they're not really eligible for any scholarship or aid from the universities. They have to do that on their own. These kids often come here when they're very small. They don't have any papers in their home countries, and it seems to me that it's a great way to turn these people into citizens who can, contribute back to our economy. And
Kim, thank you for your call. I want to give Senator Moran a chance to answer that. We have other calls coming in, so I want to go ahead and turn it over to Senator Moran.
Well, I apologize that I disappointed you in my position, although I have to tell you I disappoint you again in that my position has not changed. And I really do think that if this issue is going to be addressed, it ought to be addressed initially at the state level, not the national level. This is about tuition costs and perhaps, and in fact, ultimate citizenship for those who are here, I admit, through no fault of their own, but they're here in a legal capacity. And I think before we ever head down the path of rewarding illegal behavior, we have to address the issue of our borders. Otherwise, all we do is encourage more people to come here illegally to get the benefits of the things that we're talking about. And, and until we have the courage, the stamina, the resources, the commitment, and quit looking the other direction in regard to our borders, I'm not a supporter of the DREAM Act.
There's some interesting stuff in there, because you're talking about it being at the state level, and yet you look at Arizona SB 1070 passing last year and got a lot of heat because it seemed as though they were trumping what the federal government was doing. So where do we draw the line between the state responsibility in dealing with our borders and where the federal responsibility is?
I'm consistent in my position, which is I think Arizona has in fact, the responsibility to deal in the absence of the federal government doing its job. All I see is the Arizona legislature and governor are trying to protect the citizens of their state, lives and property, by a failure of the federal government to do its responsibility. The number one responsibility of our federal government is to defend our country. And we often think about that being war, but I think it involves our borders as well. And our borders are not just about immigration. This is a crime and national security issue that demands our attention. And I am so troubled by the drug wars and the consequences of those drug wars along our borders that this is a real and serious problem that the federal government has looked the other way for far too long. And so I actually think that I'm so disappointed that this current administration is suing Arizona to prevent them from enforcing the law. One would think that rather than spending the money to sue a state, which in at least my view is doing what it needs to do, you'd spend that money to fix the problem on the border.
And let's assume that we can get the problem on the border fixed, because that is a legitimate need and a prerequisite, I'm sure, for anything. But if we get the border secured, then we do have generation plus of people who were brought into this country as kids, born here in the U.S. from illegal parents. What do we do for them, with them? What's the answer for that part of the puzzle?
I think that that the reality of fixing the border then changes the dynamic. We can talk about all these other issues that follow once the border is fixed, but when we provide benefits to people who are here illegally, one, my common sense tells me we encourage other people, other parents, to say, let me bring my kids here so they get the benefit. And then secondly, we spend money that we don't have, and again goes back to the earlier issue of the deficit. And finally, we put people who are waiting to come to the United States in a legal fashion behind those who violated the law. And so when people talk to me about fairness of taking care of people who are here illegally, I understand their point of view. I understand the point they're trying to make is, and particularly with kids, it's hard to argue that through no fault of their own they're in this position. But if you put them ahead of those who are doing it right, where is the fairness in that? Yeah. And so I understand these are complicated issues, and I recognize that when we meet somebody who we discover is here illegally, I've had these conversations with lots of Kansans. They're very interested in protecting the border, but once they know somebody that's here, they want to make sure they help them to be able to stay here. And we've got to fix the border before we make any decisions about the consequences of those who are already here.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the phones, and Joanne from Ellsworth is on the line. Thank you for calling in. What's your question?
Hi, Jerry. This is Joanne. My question is the same old one. What are we doing to help our veterans that are returning home now that don't have a job and can't find a job because they're cutting the budget and the deficits? Look at the smile on his face. And they can't find jobs, or to help them in the VA hospitals and stuff where they're not getting help there to help them find jobs. What are we doing about this situation?
Well, Joanne is a great volunteer, a great advocate for veterans, and it's more than just words. She works on an ongoing basis to make sure they get what they're entitled to. And at the moment, the budgets have not been cut. In fact, part of the fastest growing part of our budget in the past several years has been increased funding for veterans to meet the commitment that was made, particularly for veteran health care. Now, we'll see how the budgets develop. You heard me, if you were listening earlier, you heard me say the one thing we might take off the table are these kinds of things to make sure that those who serve their country get what they have been promised. And certainly you don't balance the books on the backs of those who sacrificed so much. So as you know, well, I shouldn't pat myself on the back. I would say we've worked very closely together with veterans. I served for all the time I was in the House of Representatives as a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, and I asked for that appointment in the Senate and received it. So I continue to be a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the Senate, and our efforts on behalf of veterans, including homelessness, health care, benefits, we've improved, at least in my conversations with veterans across Kansas, we've improved the quality and availability of health care to the veterans of our state, 250,000 of them, over the last decade. We need to continue that. We need to focus more on the benefits, which continue to be a significant bureaucracy and a long waiting time. And I think the greatest challenge we face at the moment is the ongoing deployments of men and women from Kansas and across the country who serve in Iraq and Afghanistan on multiple deployments, and the consequences of that ongoing service are mental health issues, financial, family, and we need to make certain that that receives the attention. And in my view, the attention is there, but it's not sufficient, and we're going to continue the battle to make sure that that increases and occurs.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the other changing nature of your job. Move over to the Senate. Your committee seniority goes away. You get new committee assignments, and you've gotten a few of these assignments. One of them is you're on the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee.
I smile whenever you say urban affairs. It doesn't seem like something that Kansas should be on.
Well, but let's talk about the part of that I think really does hit home for Kansans, and that's housing.
Absolutely.
Because specifically, the mortgage crisis was one of the central problems leading to the economic downturn that we're still trying to deal with in 2008. So as I was reading my local newspaper today, Hayes Daily News featured a headline claiming that the era of low mortgage rates may be over. Is that right? Is that correct, do you think? And if so, is it a good or a bad thing?
Well, first of all, low mortgage interest rates may be over, not necessarily because of changes in policy or legislation in Washington, D.C., but they are going to be affected by the tremendous borrowing that the United States is doing to finance its debt. And as interest rates rise, because the federal government is borrowing so much money, the demand for the borrowed money increases. It means interest rates are going to go up, and I think that's particularly true because our current Federal Reserve is monetizing the debt, which means we have lots of dollars out there. Inflation begins to occur, and interest rates will rise. So I think I'm certainly not. I've refinanced my home trying to capture those lower interest rates. I don't know exactly what point in time it's the bottom and when they're going to start rising. We've seen the evidence that they're increasing now. So in that sense, I think mortgage rates go up certainly in the future. The other part of that is that the federal government has, through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae, these government organizations, supported organizations, have provided assistance in packaging loans, and therefore, in a sense, the full faith and credit of the United States is behind your mortgage, and so they put these loans together in a package and are able to sell them, which has the consequence of lower interest rates, easier borrowing. I think the point of the Hayes Daily News article today is the Obama administration has suggested 3 alternatives for us to look at as to what we ought to do with these government agencies that are bankrupt, spent too much money. We've spent billions of dollars in bailing them out, and not with my vote, still the politician in me, not with my vote. And the question is, are they going to continue? And that's certainly up in the air, and it is the Banking Committee that will have primary jurisdiction over these issues. And so that story will be written in the future. The other part of that is that I do think, when you say is that a good thing or a bad thing, I think the programs that we have encouraged, federal laws and policies that have encouraged people to borrow money to buy a house when they have the inability to pay back the loan, these subprime mortgages were a terrible mistake, and in part were encouraged by government policies that had the belief that everybody ought to be a homeowner. Everybody ought to be a homeowner that can afford to buy a home. And that's not the case with every person, and so we do need to change those policies that make And you know, it's sad to me. I don't think, almost without exception, our Kansas banks didn't loan money to people who couldn't afford the house. We still say, and you know, the banker still tells, I'm sorry, I can't loan you this money. You can't afford this house. But there were those who did, and the consequences of packaging these together and making them securities for big Wall Street firms to sell had huge consequences. And presumably, at least from my point of view, presumably the bailout then allowed them off the hook, and we did not address the real underlying problem.
Okay, well, let's keep the calls coming in. We have Ed from Colby on the line. Thanks for joining us. What's your question?
Yes, I'd like to ask the senator about how he feels about the blend of ethanol in the fuel being increased to 15% in light of the fact that we're having a drought here in the Midwest and food inflation. Land is appreciated out in this part of the country 700% in the last decade. And once the ethanol industry hits this 15% blend wall, will it be increased again? And it's kind of my understanding that if we planted all the 300 million acres that are available in this country to corn to make ethanol, no cotton, no vineyards, no hay, no tobacco, no CRP, that we would still only provide 15% of our gasoline needs through corn ethanol. If every acre in the country was for corn ethanol, we'd still only be providing 15% of our gasoline needs. How do you feel about that?
I think you'll see, in fact, I think the ethanol industry recognizes that their, quote, glory days in the Congress are behind them. And they are in the process of proposing an elimination, for example, of the, at least a reduction and ultimate elimination of the blender's tax credit. And I think the bloom has diminished in the support for ethanol. I've been an ethanol supporter. I'm not, the idea that food prices are rising, I think one of the things that is never stated in those articles is, and I'd love to know the number, and I've asked to have this told to me, and I get varying, the problem we all face is, who do you believe? But I think someplace at least 10 cents a gallon is an accurate number, that the price of gasoline is 10 cents less a gallon because we have the presence of ethanol. And I just want that other compensating fact out there. And the amount of corn that goes into a box of cornflakes is pretty minimal as far as the price. And I've always noticed that the price of food goes up rapidly but comes down slowly when the price of wheat or corn or when the input costs go up. So I think the answer to that is that ethanol's tax support will diminish certainly over time, and I don't think it's a very long period of time. And the promotion will be more on the side of trying to compete in the market for the consumer's dollar. On the issue of the blend, the 15%, the EPA is making these decisions and has made at least a partial decision in support of the increased blend in ethanol, but only for recent model automobiles. And I think the exact consequence of that decision by the EPA is pretty minimal when it comes to increasing the demand for ethanol. Finally, I would say in a broader picture, I generally dislike, I don't even need the word generally, I dislike the intrusion of government into the market in making decisions about what is valuable to the consumer. But I also have a sincere belief that our dependence on foreign oil is a real problem for our country, and particularly you can look at what's going on in Egypt today and think, would we not be better off as a nation if we developed our full array of energy potential here in the United States? And that's oil and gas, it's renewables, it's certainly nuclear, it's biomass. We ought to be doing a lot more. The T. Boone Pickens ad that has the smoke going across the screen and talks about $800 billion being spent annually going outside the United States to buy oil tells me that we ought to be able to capture a significant portion of that $800 billion in our own economy, put people to work here, and get rid of the national security threat and the funding of terrorism that comes with our continual purchase of oil from abroad.
Wonderful. I want to try to get at least one more phone call in. We have Tim from Yates Center on the line. Thank you for calling in. What's your question?
That's a message that my answers are too long.
Tim, thank you for calling in. What's your question?
The Bush tax cuts shifted wealth to the richest, while the poor in America have seen their share of the country's wealth go down. with the deficit growing, why not end this subsidy of the rich?
I think, first of all, I would say that the tax code needs to be dramatically reformed, and the current tax code is not the appropriate way to do that. It's been modified so many times by every special interest who has their desire to see the tax code do something to benefit them. I'm a supporter of a whole different wholesale kind of change in our tax code, and I would say that more so than the amount of taxes that we generate, we ought to be working at simplifying the tax code, and I'm skeptical that it's ever going to happen. What I would say is that I've never seen in observing the federal government that raising taxes results in reducing the deficit, because raising taxes results in spending more money. It just becomes easier to spend. It's never locked away in deficit reduction. And I also think that we need to recognize how we do those tax changes that you propose have significant consequences, at least on some Americans who have their corporations or private businesses are sole proprietorships, and they put their money back into their business. So in today's fragile economy, we got to be very careful that you don't alter the tax code that reduces the chance that somebody's going to expand their business. And I get that sense that Chap is telling me quit talking.
Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time. I'd love to be able to continue the conversation. I know there's plenty of folks here watching, calling in, who would love the opportunity as well. But in the time we have, I'd like to thank Senator Jerry Moran for joining us today for this conversation, as well as all of the Kansans who have tweeted, emailed, called in with questions for the senator. The stakes for our society today are higher than they've been in generations, perhaps, and keeping the communication pipeline open between the people and their representatives is vital. So that's why we're proud to be a part of this. We are very grateful that our senator, our junior senator from Kansas, Jerry Moran, has joined us. And we want to thank you for joining us tonight on Smoky Hills Public Television. Thank you and good night.